Do you believe that unexpected connections can change the course of your life forever? The sky over Manhattan was filled with shades of gray, with dense clouds that seemed to press down on the skyscrapers, announcing imminent rain. From the top of the 47th floor of one of the city's most imposing buildings, Carter Innovations exuded the power of a company on the rise. Inside his meeting room, William Carter, the company's CEO, commanded the space with the same intensity with which he ran his business. The room was a combination of elegance and functionality. The air carried a subtle scent of leather upholstery and freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the cool, metallic feel of stainless steel surfaces. William was leaning over the conference table, analyzing graphs projected on the screen before him. Each line and curve represented the advancements of Orion, Carter Innovations' most ambitious artificial intelligence project. The silence was broken only by the constant sound of the clock on the wall and the keyboard of assistant Richard, who was typing urgently. William looked up at the clock. Tycoon Richard Blake, a client whose influence could open doors or abruptly close them, was about to arrive. The pressure was almost tangible, but for William, this was routine. He lived for those moments when absolute control was not just a requirement, but an expectation. What he didn't expect was the sudden and audacious interruption that followed. The door opened with a sharp sound, revealing the unmistakable click of high heels crossing the marble floor. The pace was a curious combination of determination and inexperience, and the voice that echoed through the room seemed disconcerting, both in its energy and its unexpected presence. "Excuse me," announced Stella Monroe, entering with almost rehearsed confidence. William looked up, his thoughts of strategy and contracts instantly interrupted. Stella was a vision that was completely at odds with the austere environment at Carter Innovations. Wearing a vibrant pink dress that defied the corporate dress code, she held a rolling bag in one hand while balancing an equally eye-catching tote bag on her shoulder. His smile was wide, almost captivating, but William saw it as a provocation. He frowned, his eyes narrowing in a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Who are you? And what do you think you're doing here?" His sharp voice carried a tone that made Richard, the assistant, stop typing for a moment. Stella was not intimidated. With the same exaggerated energy, she stepped forward and held out her hand. "Stella Monroe, your new personal assistant." The statement hung in the air, generating an uncomfortable pause. Richard coughed nervously, while William looked at Stella as if she were a bad joke told at the wrong time. "New? What?" William repeated, slowly, with his brow furrowed in an expression that mixed confusion and contempt. He turned to Richard, now clearly annoyed. "Why wasn't I informed about this?" Before Richard could respond, the door opened again. This time, Linda Pierce entered the room. Her firm posture and calculated gaze showed that she was prepared for the storm she knew she was about to face. "William, I need you to listen before you react." Linda raised her hand in a gesture that asked for calm. William crossed his arms, his face hardened. "It's already off to a bad start. Explain now, because I don't have time for that." Linda glanced briefly at Stella, who now looked less confident, but still determined. "Stella is here at Richard Blake's insistence," Linda said firmly. "He is our biggest client, and this is part of an agreement that we need to honor." "Agreement? What agreement?" William interrupted, the impatience in his voice increasing. Before Linda could respond, Stella stepped forward, adjusting her coat and straightening her shoulders as if she were about to appear in front of an audience. "My career has suffered a bit of a setback recently," she began, with a smile that seemed both genuine and forced. "To clean up my image, I was offered experience in the corporate world. They say this will help me connect better with a role I'm considering for my next film." She paused dramatically, as if hoping William would understand the depth of this opportunity. "And your company was chosen for this?" William raised his eyebrows, his expression becoming even more skeptical. "Minor setback?" he repeated, before turning to Linda. "Are we accepting broke actors now? Is this some kind of joke?" Linda remained calm, although her posture revealed that she was struggling to maintain control of the situation. "Richard Blake has made it clear that if we refuse this demand, he will withdraw the contract." The silence in the room became heavy. William looked at Stella and then Linda, processing what that meant. He knew Carter Innovations couldn't afford to lose a client like Richard Blake, but accepting Stella Monroe seemed like too high a price. "I'm a CEO, not a nanny," he said finally, his voice cold as ice. "Ah, don't worry, Mr. Carter," Stella replied, with a confident smile that bordered on teasing. "I don't need a babysitter. I am perfectly capable of learning." William let out a short laugh without a trace of humor. "We'll see." He turned to Linda. 3 months. One more day, and I'll put her out myself." "Deal done," Linda replied, keeping her expression neutral. As Stella made her way to her assigned table, an empty station in the corner of the main room, William shot Linda a warning look. "This is going to be a disaster." "Or an opportunity," Linda replied calmly before leaving the room. Across the room, Stella began unpacking her small collection of personal items. A glitter water bottle, a pink pillow, and multicolored papers began to fill the space, drawing curious glances and hushed whispers from the other employees. William watched her from afar, her every movement confirming his worst fears. She was a complete disaster, a clash of colors and chaos in a world he had built to be controlled and orderly. And yet, as he turned his attention to the charts and prepared for his meeting with Richard Blake, something about Stella seemed to poke at a part of him that had long been dormant, a slight discomfort that, he didn't know, was about to transform his life and his company in ways he could never have imagined. Mornings at the Carter Innovations office were marked by almost surgical precision. The rhythmic sound of keyboards, the light whisper of paper being handled, and the occasional clink of a spoon against a cup of coffee created a subtle but effective soundtrack. The aroma of gourmet coffee permeated the air, mixing with the metallic smell of technological devices and the discreet perfume of employees who hurried past with meticulously calculated steps. It was an environment designed to maximize productivity, a temple of order, until Stella Monroe showed up. Sitting at her makeshift desk in the corner of the office, Stella looked like a child trying to solve an advanced calculus equation. His frowning face was fixed on the computer screen as his fingers hesitated over the keyboard. The cursor blinked impatiently, and she bit her lower lip hard, trying to ignore the growing desperation she felt. "Okay, focus, focus," she muttered to herself, clicking on an icon in the hope that it was the right one. It wasn't. Somehow, she managed to change the system language to Spanish, making everything even more confusing. The muffled sound of her sigh of frustration mixed with the light click of the mouse, which she now pressed repeatedly, as if that would magically solve the problem. On the other side of the glass that separated William Carter's office from the main room, the CEO himself watched Stella with a mixture of disbelief and irritation that seemed to grow exponentially. He was sitting in his black leather armchair, his hands clasped under his chin and his eyes fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. Every clumsy movement she made seemed to echo in his mind like an out-of-tune symphony. When Stella finally decided to get up to get some coffee, disaster struck. As she pushed her chair back, she hit the desk behind her, knocking a perfectly aligned stack of papers onto the floor. The sound of papers scattering made several employees look up, exchanging surprised and amused glances. William, however, was not amused. He stood up abruptly and opened the door to his office so quickly that Stella stopped mid-motion, holding a cup of coffee that was shaking slightly in her hand. "Can you please make less noise?" His voice was cold, filled with an authority that cut like a blade. "This isn't a film set." Stella pursed her lips, resisting the urge to respond with something equally cutting. She knew she was treading on hostile ground, and that her objective there was much greater than proving that she could respond in kind. "Sorry, I'm adjusting," she replied, trying to sound diplomatic. "Adjust faster," was the short answer before he turned and walked back to his room, closing the door with a calculated firmness, but without a bang. The blush quickly crept up Stella's cheeks, and she felt the familiar burn of shame. Every little mistake seemed amplified in this rigorously structured environment, and William's criticisms had the power to penetrate right into his already shaken confidence. Determined to redeem herself, Stella tried to dive into her tasks with renewed energy. The first of them seemed simple: organizing William's meeting schedule. However, when she opened the calendar, she was greeted with a tangle of appointments, time zones and cryptic notes that looked like an alien language. "Okay, this can't be that complicated, right?" he murmured, leaning closer to the screen. After making 2 appointments at the same time on different continents, Stella finally handed the calendar to William, trying to sound confident. He picked up the tablet, giving it a quick look before letting out a heavy sigh. "You set up a meeting in Hong Kong at the same time I'm supposed to be at the investor presentation in Manhattan." His voice was controlled, but full of frustration. "Do you think I'm capable of being in 2 places at once?" "I can fix that," Stella replied, her confidence quickly crumbling. "I hope so. Because if you can't organize a calendar, we're in serious trouble." Back at her table, Stella felt the weight of William's words. She knew she was making mistakes, but nothing seemed to ease the feeling of inadequacy he made her feel. When the phone rang on her desk, Stella answered it quickly, wanting to at least do something right that day. "Carter Innovations, Stella speaking." A brief pause preceded the response of a deep, authoritative voice on the other end of the line. "I need to speak to Mr. Carter." "Of course. Who is speaking?" "Richard Blake." Stella froze. He was the company's most important customer. She knew she needed to transfer the call immediately, but as she looked at her phone, she realized she had no idea how to operate the extension system. "One moment, please," she said, trying to sound confident as she pressed random buttons. A sharp sound and final click indicated that the line had gone down. Oh no. Almost instantly, William's office door opened again, and he appeared with an expression that seemed to carry the full weight of his frustration. "Did you just hang up on Richard Blake?" "It was an accident." Stella raised her hands in a defensive gesture, her eyes wide. William ran a hand over his face, closing his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to muster what little patience he had left. "I'll deal with it. Just try not to do any more damage." At the end of the day, Stella stayed behind. The room was now silent, except for the occasional sound of keys being pressed. The aroma of cold coffee still lingered in the air, as Stella determinedly watched tutorials on how to organize calendars and operate corporate systems. William, who was leaving, stopped when he saw her so concentrated. For a moment, he just watched, seeing something in Stella that he hadn't noticed before. An almost stubborn resilience, a determination that seemed at odds with her bumbling. He considered saying something, but decided to move on. Still, her efforts did not go unnoticed. The Carter Innovations office, normally an orchestra of efficiency, seemed even more dynamic that morning. The air was thick with the constant sound of keyboards, the clink of coffee cups against saucers, and the murmurs of rapid conversations among employees. The aroma of fresh coffee was almost omnipresent, mixed with the faint metallic smell of electronic equipment. However, in William Carter's room, the atmosphere was one of absolute concentration. William was sitting in his black leather chair, his posture rigid as ever. The natural light streaming in through the large windows reflected off his perfectly fitted dark blue suit, highlighting the sharp features of his face. On the table in front of him, a series of slides flashed on his laptop screen, each one detailing aspects of the Orion project, an artificial intelligence platform that promised to revolutionize the corporate market. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but his mind was in multiple places at once. Orion was more than just a project. It was a statement of power and innovation from Carter Innovations. However, there was a persistent threat. Titan Dynamics, its biggest competitor, was clearly committed to sabotaging the initiative, using methods that went beyond corporate ethics. The sound of high heels echoed through the hallway, breaking the bubble of concentration that surrounded William. He looked up just as the door to his office unceremoniously opened, revealing Stella Monroe, balancing a stack of papers that looked like it was about to collapse. "Good morning," Stella said with a nervous smile as she entered. Its floral scent invaded the room, contrasting with the strong smell of coffee coming from the cup next to William. He raised an eyebrow, the stern expression that had become almost a characteristic feature. "Is that what you call discretion?" he asked in a cold and controlled tone. "You asked for these reports 2 hours ago. I'm delivering it," she replied, panting, as she placed the papers on the table with a movement that inevitably caused half of them to fall to the floor. William closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply as if trying to contain his frustration. "Stella, you are the personification of chaos. I prefer the term unpredictable." She tried to disarm him with a smile, but he remained unshakable. As the two bent down to collect the papers, William's gaze stopped on one of the documents. He picked up the report, eyes narrowing as he read it. The title highlighted a possible threat to Orion security, and the name Titan Dynamics appeared in bold. "What is that?" Stella asked, leaning over to try and see what he was reading. "Nothing you need to know." Her response came quickly, laced with a touch of indignation. "Of course, because I'm just the clumsy assistant, right?" William looked up, his expression now more serious. "Exactly." Stella crossed her arms, her defiant posture contrasting with the lightness of the perfume that still hung in the air. "Look, I may not be a technology expert, but I know a name. Titan Dynamics was involved in a project that almost destroyed my career." William hesitated, his eyes fixed on her for longer than usual. "This has nothing to do with you. How can you know?" "They fabricated evidence against me to protect someone influential. If they're trying to sabotage Orion, they might be using the same methods." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And you think I should base my corporate strategy on a conspiracy theory?" Stella bowed slightly, her gaze steady. "It's not a theory, William. It's reality, and you know it." For a moment, the tension in the room became palpable, as if the air had grown heavier. William maintained his rigid stance, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he was considering her words, however reluctantly. "If you want to help, bring something more concrete than assumptions." His voice was firm, but less cutting. Stella felt the weight of his words, but decided that she would not back down. "I'll do it. And when I prove myself right, you'll have to admit that you underestimated me." She left the room, the sound of her heels echoing through the hallway, leaving behind the scent of her perfume and the feeling of a struggle that was far from over. Later that night, the office was almost empty. Soft lights illuminated the silent hallways, and the occasional sound of a printer was the only sign of life. Stella was sitting at her desk, her laptop open in front of her, as she browsed through old reports and financial news related to Titan Dynamics. The aroma of cold coffee still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of paper and printer ink. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but his mind revisited the events that ruined his career. Every click of the mouse seemed to bring up memories of her ex-boyfriend, who manipulated everything around him to cover up his own flaws. When he found a possible connection between Titan Dynamics and the consulting firm associated with him, his heart sank. It was a clue, still fragile, but enough for her to believe she was on the right path. The next morning, William arrived early, as usual. The air was fresh, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. But something caught his attention. Stella was already there. She looked exhausted but determined, with a carefully prepared folder of documents on the table. "Good morning," he said, without hiding his surprise. "Not exactly," she replied, handing him the folder. "Here's the proof you asked for." He opened the folder, skepticism visible in his expression. But as he examined the documents, his stance changed. The connections Stella had drawn were impressive, detailing suspicious transactions that pointed directly to Titan Dynamics. "Did you spend all night working on this?" he asked, his surprise evident. "Yes, because, contrary to what you think, I take my work seriously." William closed the folder, his expression softer than Stella had ever seen. "That's still not enough to take action, but it's a solid start." "A solid start coming from you almost sounds like a compliment," she replied, smiling slightly. William watched her for a moment, as if he was seeing something new in her. "Don't get used to it," he said, returning his attention to the papers. While Stella returned to her desk, feeling exhausted but satisfied, William was left alone in his office, looking at the documents. He knew that Titan Dynamics didn't play fair, and that if he wanted to protect Orion, he would have to start considering all possibilities. And for the first time, he began to realize that Stella Monroe could be more than a makeshift assistant. The day dawned with a thick layer of gray clouds covering Manhattan, like a heavy blanket that reflected the mood of those who walked through the city's busy streets. Inside the Carter Innovations building, the atmosphere was a combination of corporate efficiency and unspoken tension. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee permeated the air, mixing with the incessant sound of keyboards and the faint hum of computer fans. Everything seemed as usual, but there was something in the air that promised unexpected twists. In William Carter's room, the atmosphere was even heavier. The huge wooden table was covered in piles of documents, financial reports, and projection graphs. William, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit that accentuated his authoritative presence, sat in his leather chair. The blue eyes were fixed on the monitor in front of him, analyzing contractual clauses with the same intensity as someone deciphering a riddle. His expression was rigid, his jaw clenched, revealing the stress that the international client and his new demands were causing him. Across the floor, Stella Monroe was at her desk, struggling to organize a tangle of documents and emails that had accumulated since early in the morning. Her hair, hastily tied into a bun, began to let out unruly strands that framed her face. Despite the chaos in front of her, she was focused, still savoring the light floral scent of her perfume, mixed with the smell of freshly printed paper. She didn't know exactly how, but she felt that that day would be decisive. Suddenly, Richard, William's direct assistant, appeared in the hallway, balancing a tray with 2 cups of coffee. His voice sounded loud, drawing the attention of everyone around him. "Stella, Mr. Carter needs you in his office. Now." Stella hurriedly stood up, almost knocking over her chair as she did so. With quick steps, she crossed the hallway, feeling the cold of the air conditioning intensify as she approached William's office door. Upon entering, she was greeted by the sight of William leaning over his desk, eyes fixed on the monitor. The soft light coming in from the huge windows reflected off his slightly loose tie, something rare for someone so meticulous. "Close the door," he ordered without looking up. She obeyed, feeling the weight of the silence in that room. "I need you to help me organize these documents. Each of them is a clause proposed by the client, and I need them to be categorized by priority." Stella approached the table and picked up the papers. As he began to leaf through them, a graph in one of the reports caught his eye. His eyebrows drew together in an arch of curiosity and concern. "These numbers don't make sense," he muttered, not realizing he had spoken out loud. William immediately stopped what he was doing and looked at her with a sharp look. "What did you say?" She hesitated for a second, but forced herself to continue. "Those numbers, they don't match what I saw in yesterday's report." William raised an eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "And why do you think you know more than my risk analysis team?" Stella felt the weight of the words, but her determination spoke louder. "Because I read the report. I was trying to understand more about the Orion project, and maybe it's just a guess, but I think someone may have manipulated the data." The silence that followed was so intense that Stella could almost hear the sound of her own breathing. William watched her as if trying to decipher her intentions, his expression a mixture of irritation and evaluation. "Are you saying someone is trying to sabotage us?" he asked with a coldness that made her heart quicken. "I don't have concrete proof, but yes, that's what it seems." William pursed his lips, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. He picked up the phone in one quick, precise movement. "I need a new analysis of the risk reports." Now he ordered the security team. As they waited for the answer, William turned his attention to Stella, his eyes piercing as always. "If you're wrong, you're wasting my time. And if I'm right, maybe I saved your company," she replied, crossing her arms and meeting his gaze. The security team arrived within minutes. They analyzed the reports in silence, while Stella and William watched in tense expectation. When they finally confirmed that there were discrepancies in the data, the room was filled with heavy silence. William looked at Stella, his expression difficult to decipher. "It seems you were right," he said, reluctantly, but without hiding the admiration that was beginning to emerge. Stella felt a slight relief, but maintained her composure. "Glad I trusted my instinct," she said, with a small, victorious smile. William didn't respond, but his gaze remained on her for a few seconds longer than necessary before returning to work. Later, Stella was alone in the office kitchen, making a cup of tea. The sound of the liquid filling the cup was comforting, as was the soft scent of chamomile that mingled with the room. She was lost in her thoughts, trying to process what had happened earlier. Suddenly, William's voice brought her back to reality. "So you think you saved the day?" She turned, surprised to see him standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. His face was more relaxed, which made him almost unrecognizable. "Actually, I think I saved your day," she replied, offering him a cup of coffee she had prepared. William took the cup, his fingers briefly touching hers. A brief moment, but filled with something they both dared not acknowledge. "You are surprising, to say the least. I'll take that as a compliment. Don't overdo it," he said, but there was a faint smile on his lips. They shared a moment of silence that, for once, wasn't uncomfortable. There was something new in the dynamic between them, something that not even William could deny. When he left the kitchen, Stella stared at the cup in her hands, feeling a mixture of relief and accomplishment. William, on the other hand, returned to work with a new realization. Stella Monroe was much more than he expected, and that somehow intrigued him. The cold glow of fluorescent lights reflected off the building's windows, contrasting with the growing darkness outside. It was one of those nights when work at Carter Innovation seemed never-ending, with documents still piled up on desks and the core team in endless meetings. William Carter, sitting in his leather armchair, analyzed reports with a fixed gaze. At that moment, the absolute silence of his office was interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of his pens tapping lightly on the table. Outside, Stella Monroe, tired after a long day, stared at her reflection in a pane of glass as she tied her hair into an awkward bun. That day had been a test of patience, but somehow, she felt like she was starting to find her place in this world. Yet something still hung over her, an invisible weight that never quite went away. The past always followed her, like a shadow, and that night, something in the air, or perhaps in her own restless heart, made her finally decide to face it head-on. With a light knock on the door, Stella entered William's office without waiting for permission. He looked up, slightly surprised by the interruption, but said nothing. She held a folder tightly, as if what was inside was precious, and at the same time, dangerous. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm, but with a slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. William put down the pen and looked at her carefully. There was something about her posture, her serious expression, and the slightly melancholy gleam in her eyes that made him close the report in front of him. "About what?" Stella took a deep breath, approaching the table and placing the folder in front of him. He cautiously opened the folder and found newspaper clippings, email screenshots, and sensational news reports. Images of Stella, accompanied by an imposing-looking man at gala events, frozen smiles for cameras, headlines accusing her of corruption, contract manipulation, and even fraud. "I know you think you know me, but there's more to me than the things you've seen or heard since I got here. That," she pointed to the papers on the table, "is why I'm here. The reason my acting career ended." William scanned the documents with the same analytical precision he used on contracts. Her expression remained neutral, but her silence kept her going. "The man in these photos is Jonathan Blake." The name made William look up abruptly. "Jonathan Blake? He is—" "Yes, brother of Richard Blake, our most important client," Stella interrupted. William stood still for a moment, processing the information. Jonathan Blake was a well-known name in New York business circles, especially in technology and investment sectors. He was as ambitious as he was ruthless, but his connection with scandal had always been carefully hushed up. "He was my boyfriend," continued Stella, looking away from an undefined spot on the floor. "At first, everything seemed perfect. He was charming, successful, caring, or at least that's what he let on. But over time, I began to realize that he was using me, not only to promote his business, but to cover up things that were illegal." William remained silent, his gaze unwavering. "When I finally realized what was happening, it was too late. He set me up to look like the culprit. He forged evidence, manipulated contracts in my name, and when everything came to light, I was the only one to pay the price." Stella's voice got quieter, but there was a raw intensity to it. "My career was destroyed. My friendships, my credibility, everything I had was taken." William leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He wasn't known for being compassionate, but something about that confession bothered him. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her voice, or maybe it was the way she still stood tall, facing him head-on. "And why tell me this now?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Stella looked up, meeting his. "Because I saw his name associated with Titan Dynamics, And because you need to know who you're dealing with. Do you think Jonathan Blake is involved in the sabotage against Orion? I don't think so. I'm sure, she said, the confidence in her voice as clear as the sparkle in her eyes. William was silent for a long moment. After a deep sigh, he closed the folder and stood up. I'll look into it. Stella's eyes widened in surprise. You are going? I'm not the type to ignore important information. Besides, if he's a threat to Orion, I can't allow this to continue. For a moment, Stella felt a wave of relief and gratitude, but also a twinge of doubt. Do you think he will be easy to face? Jonathan has power, connections. He always finds a way to come out on top. William looked at her with a firmness that almost made her flinch. I'm not like you, Stella. I don't shy away from confrontations. She felt a slight tightening in her chest at the harshness of his words, but there was also something in them that comforted her. He believed her at least enough to act. After Stella left the office, William remained there, analyzing the documents again. Every detail seemed to fit into a larger narrative, but he knew he needed more. Picking up the phone, he called one of his trusted connections in the corporate security industry. I need complete information on Jonathan Blake and his connections to Titan Dynamics. Leave no stone unturned. When he hung up, William leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Jonathan Blake was a dangerous player, and getting involved with him was not something William did lightly. However, there was something deeper that drove him. Maybe it was Stella's determination, or maybe it was something he wasn't ready to admit to himself. Meanwhile, Stella walked to her desk, feeling strangely light. She wasn't sure if she had done the right thing by sharing that piece of her life with William, but there was something in his eyes that made her believe he would help her. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. The night progressed, and while the building's lights remained on, two minds, as different as day and night, were connected by the same goal, the truth. The Hotel Astoria's function room sparkled like a true palace of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung majestically from the vaulted ceiling, casting golden reflections that danced across the red silk walls. Every detail seemed meticulously planned to impress, from the arrangements of white roses that decorated the marble tables, exuding a subtle and refined perfume, to the plush carpet that cushioned the guests' footsteps. There was something almost magical about that space, a harmony between sophistication and the warmth of the soft light that made the environment both grand and welcoming. Stella Monroe walked across the room with a posture that exuded confidence, but inside her, her nerves pulsed like a tense rope about to snap. Her navy blue dress flowed around her body with a satiny fabric that seemed to absorb and reflect the lights of the room, shimmering slightly with each movement. It had been chosen carefully, discreet enough not to appear flashy, but elegant enough to convey an air of royalty. The high-heeled shoes with a discreet shine made a slight click on the marble floor, echoing amid the low conversations and soft laughter of the guests. Stella's makeup was impeccable but light, highlighting her bright eyes that, despite the tension, maintained the charm of someone who had once dominated the spotlight. The pearl necklace around her neck seemed to be a link between the glamorous past she had lost and the new strength she was beginning to build. William Carter stood beside her, a figure of authority and grace. His black suit was impeccably cut, with lines that accentuated his imposing presence. He exuded an apparent calm, but Stella noticed the small details, the fingers that adjusted the button on his jacket, more often than usual, the way his eyes swept the room as if analyzing each face. His woody scent, with subtle notes of cedar and bergamot, seemed to complement the security he emanated. When they reached the foot of the staircase that led to the main hall, William paused and looked at Stella. His eyes were softer than she expected, almost as if he was trying to convey something without words. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low and firm, but with a touch of concern that Stella couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath, smelling the floral scent around her as a reminder of the environment she was supposed to dominate. "I have no choice, do I?" "No, but remember, you don't have to face anyone alone." His words, so simple, carried a comforting weight that she hadn't expected. For the first time, Stella felt like maybe she could trust someone other than herself. She nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. As they walked up the stairs, the sound of Stella's heels echoed, attracting the attention of some guests who were already in the room. When they finally crossed the large double doors, a low murmur began to spread throughout the room. Curious and surprised looks turned to Stella, many recognizing her immediately. It was an inevitable reaction, and Stella knew it, but the intensity of those looks still made her heart race. "It looks like you still know how to make an entrance," William commented, with a light, almost playful tone. Stella replied with a short smile. Old custom. But there was a shadow in her eyes, a reminder that not everyone there was happy to see her. Many of the faces that now whispered among themselves were the same ones that had fueled the rumors of his downfall. As they walked through the room, William greeted other executives with firm handshakes and polite words, while Stella accompanied him with practiced grace, offering quick, intelligent comments. With each interaction, her confidence seemed to grow, and the genuine smile she elicited from her interlocutors showed that she still possessed the magnetism that had once made her a star. However, that confidence was shaken when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Stella Monroe. "Still stealing the show, I see." She turned around slowly, feeling a chill run up her spine. There he was, Jonathan Blake, impeccable as always. His light gray suit was almost a reflection of his personality, brilliant on the surface, but cold and calculated. His blue eyes sparkled with a mixture of sarcasm and pleasure, and his smile carried the mark of a predator who felt he had found his prey. Stella tried to maintain her composure, but William immediately noticed the change in her posture. His previously relaxed shoulders were now rigid, and the champagne glass in his hand shook slightly. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Jonathan like a protective shield. "Jonathan Blake, I didn't think I'd find you here," William said, his voice sharp but polite. "William Carter, the pleasure is mine." Jonathan extended his hand with a fake smile, but William didn't even make a move to accept it. Jonathan's smile faltered for a moment before turning back to Stella. "You look great, Stella. You know, I don't think anyone here would believe that just a few years ago you were, how can I say this, sunk in scandals?" Stella felt her anger rise like a wave, but she swallowed hard, refusing to lose control. "The past does not define the future, Jonathan. And unlike you, I learned to deal with the consequences of my actions." There was a moment of silence, and Jonathan's smile tightened. "Always so witty. It's a shame that not everyone agrees with your version of the story." Before Stella could respond, William intervened, his voice firm as steel. "I think we can leave the judgment to those who really matter." Jonathan shot William a cold look, but was forced to step back as a group of guests approached to greet him. He took one last look at Stella before walking away, but the message was clear. This was far from over. "Are you well?" William asked once Jonathan was out of reach. Stella let out a long sigh, trying to ease the tension that had settled in her shoulders. "I am. I just didn't expect to see you here." William placed his hand on her shoulder, a brief gesture, but one that conveyed unexpected strength. "He can't get to you if you don't let him." William's words stayed with Stella for the rest of the night. As the events around her continued, Jonathan's presence loomed like a shadow, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing this alone. When they finally left the event, the cold night breeze brought a relief that Stella didn't even know she needed. As they walked together to the car, she felt grateful, but not just for William's words. There was something about the way he stood next to you that made everything seem a little less scary. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice soft but sincere. William looked at her, his eyes carrying something she couldn't fully decipher. "For what?" "For supporting me inside. I know you didn't have to do this." He gave a slight smile, but there was something else in his expression, an intensity that made her heart race. "Maybe I have more reasons than you realize." Stella's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to slow down. But before she could say anything, William opened the car door for her, ending the conversation. As the car drove along the brightly lit streets of Manhattan, Stella looked at the reflection of her face in the window. There was still a lot to be faced, but that night she knew that, for the first time in years, she was not alone. William Carter's office was plunged into a tense silence, interrupted only by the soft sound of the air conditioning and the constant clicking of the keyboard. The overhead fluorescent lights created a sterile glow over the impeccably organized table, But William's mind was far from that apparent order. He stared at the monitor, where a series of confidential files glowed in cool shades of blue and white. This was no ordinary report, and the content he had just received seemed to pulse with a weight of its own. Jonathan Blake. The name flickered across the screen like a grim reminder of everything that had spiraled out of control in the last few weeks. The investigations that William had commissioned from his security team had returned deeper and more disturbing results than he had expected. There was concrete evidence that Jonathan, using a web of shell companies, was financing a sabotage campaign against the Orion project. More than that, there were clear indications that Titan Dynamics, its fiercest rival, was a direct accomplice. William closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his thumb and forefinger against his temples. He was a man of logic and planning, but at that moment, he felt the weight of a dull anger growing in his chest. It wasn't just the fact that his project was being attacked, something he already expected in such a competitive market, but the personal involvement of Jonathan, the same man who had destroyed Stella's life. It was an uncomfortable reminder that this confrontation was becoming less and less professional and more personal. The air in the office felt heavier. He stood up, walking over to the glass window that offered a stunning view of Manhattan. Night fell slowly, dyeing the sky a deep orange that blended with shades of purple and dark blue. The city shone with its pulsating lights, but to William, everything seemed distant and colorless. He could smell the discreet smell of leather coming from his chair and the faint metallic scent that always seemed to be present in his offices, like a constant reminder of efficiency and technology. Stella. Her thought came like an unexpected wave, crashing through her reflections. Ever since last night's event, he hadn't been able to get her image out of his mind. The way she faced Jonathan with dignity and strength, even under the crushing pressure. He wondered how much he still didn't know about her, about the invisible scars she carried. There was a determination about her that intrigued him, an unbreakable spirit that made him want to protect her, even against his own instincts to remain emotionally distant. He returned to his desk, picking up his phone and quickly dialing. After 2 rings, the firm, familiar voice of Linda Pierce, head of legal at Carter Innovations, echoed over the line. "Linda, I need to talk to you now." There was urgency in his voice, which was unusual, and Linda on the other end noticed it immediately. "I'm on my way," she replied, without hesitation. Less than 10 minutes later, Linda entered the office, wearing her usual black suit and with a bulky briefcase under her arm. She had the calculated expression of someone used to dealing with critical situations. "What happened?" she asked, while William handed over the documents he had printed. "Jonathan Blake is directly linked to the sabotage against Orion. There is clear evidence that he is using shell companies to finance attacks on our infrastructure. And even worse, there's an obvious connection to Titan Dynamics." Linda flipped through the documents quickly, her eyes sharpening with each new page. "This is serious, William. If this becomes public without irrefutable proof, you will be putting not only the Orion project at risk, but the entire company." "And what do you suggest I do?" he asked, crossing his arms and leaning slightly on the table. Linda looked at him firmly. "First, we need to consolidate this information. Have you already checked the data with our security team?" "Yes, everything here has been checked." She nodded slowly, but there was visible tension on her face. "Jonathan Blake is a dangerous opponent, William. He has connections that could turn this into a long, complicated war." William narrowed his eyes, the tone of his voice colder than usual. "He has already declared war. I'm not going to sit back and watch while you destroy something I've worked on for years." Linda was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. "And Stella?" he finally asked. "Have you told her that yet?" William hesitated. He hadn't told. "I didn't know exactly why. Perhaps because part of him wanted to protect Stella from further suffering. Or perhaps because, by involving Stella, he would admit to himself that this battle was not just professional. It was about her, about how Jonathan continued to haunt her." "Not yet." Linda raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "All good. We will prepare an action plan, but you need to be aware that if this blows up, there will be no going back." After Linda left, William remained alone in the office, looking again at the documents spread out on the table. He felt the weight of the decisions he needed to make, But he also knew that, one way or another, he couldn't ignore Stella's involvement. He needed to tell her, even if it made things more complicated. That night, as the building began to empty, William found Stella still at her desk. The soft light from the lamp illuminated her face as she reviewed some documents. The discreet floral perfume she wore seemed to blend with the smell of paper and cold coffee that hung in the air. When she noticed his presence, she looked up in surprise. "Are you still here?" she asked, trying to hide the tiredness in her voice. "We need to talk." Stella immediately knew it was something important. William's serious tone was unmistakable, and she set aside her papers, straightening up in her chair. He approached, handing her the folder with the documents about Jonathan. "That's what you need to know." She began to read, and as her eyes roamed the pages, her expression changed. First came surprise, then anger, and finally something deeper, a silent sadness that she tried to hide. "So, he's behind this," she murmured, more to herself than to William. "Not just that, he's using Titan dynamics to try to destroy me," William said, his voice low but firm. Stella closed the folder tightly, her hands shaking slightly. "He won't stop, William. Jonathan is." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's the type who destroys everything and everyone to get what he wants." William bowed slightly, his expression soft but determined. "I won't allow him to destroy you again, Stella." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings that neither of them dared to fully explore. Stella met William's eyes, and for the first time, she realized how much he was willing to risk. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility that it brought. "What are we going to do?" William smiled slightly, but there was an intensity in his eyes that Stella had never seen before. "We will do whatever is necessary." And with that, the two were finally aligned, not just against Jonathan, but in something bigger. The night in Manhattan was shrouded in a veil of twinkling lights, twinkling like artificial stars in a sea of darkness. The distant sound of horns, mixed with the continuous hum of the city, created a vibrant backdrop that filtered into the quiet corners of the 47th floor of Carter Innovations. The office was in stark contrast to the urban chaos. Inside, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the methodical sound of keys pressed and papers being leafed through. Stella Monroe sat at her desk, her posture slightly hunched over as she reviewed scattered notes. His expression was tired, with his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. Her fingers held a pen as if it were a shield against the avalanche of tasks he had faced during the day. His shoulders were tense, and the slight movement of his hand to massage the back of his neck revealed the weight he carried. The smell of bitter coffee mixed with the air conditioning that blew continuously, bringing a cold current that made your skin crawl. The day had started like any other, but had quickly turned into a whirlwind of pressures and challenges. Heated meetings had left a bitter taste, like a constant reminder that she still needed to prove herself. And then there was Jonathan Blake, whose shadow hung over his mind like a threat he couldn't ignore. His invisible presence seemed to be everywhere, making every mistake or mistrust an even greater weight. Still, there was something about that night that made her feel a different spark. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue. Maybe it was the presence of William Carter. She heard the sound of his heavy office door closing with a soft click, and then the unmistakable sound of calm footsteps crossing the plush carpet. Even without looking, Stella knew it was him. William had a particular way of moving, a balance of control and determination that made his presence felt before he even spoke. When she looked up, she saw him walking towards her. He had ditched his blazer, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, exposing strong, defined forearms. His face, usually impassive, seemed marked by fatigue, but his eyes maintained their usual intensity. There was something about his posture that night, a rigidity softened by a touch of vulnerability that she had never noticed before. "Still working?" he asked, his voice low but firm, as if it were more of an observation than a question. "You too," apparently Stella replied, forcing a smile as she tried to hide the heaviness in her voice. William leaned over slightly, leaning on the edge of her desk. The woody perfume he wore, mixed with the subtle smell of paper and paint that permeated the room, seemed to surround her like a tangible presence. "Someone needs to keep things going," he replied, with a half smile that, although brief, carried a weight that Stella recognized immediately. She looked up, locking her eyes with his for longer than usual. For a moment, the layers of coldness he always carried seemed to disappear, revealing something more human. "The day was difficult," she murmured, looking away from the messy papers on the table. "It seems like the more I try to help, the more things get out of control." William leaned in even further, his hands resting on the table, making their faces dangerously close. "That's not true. Today you managed to point out an error that my entire team didn't see. You have an annoying way of being right sometimes." The unexpected sincerity brought a low laugh from Stella, a sound she herself hadn't expected to hear. "Was that a compliment?" "Maybe," he replied, and the corner of his mouth curved into an almost imperceptible smile. There was something about the way he looked at her that night. It was as if William, for a brief moment, was allowing her to see a version of him that he rarely shared with anyone. "Why do you do this?" asked Stella, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "What do I do? Carry everything on your shoulders. It's like you think you have to deal with the whole world alone." William straightened up, crossing his arms as he considered the question. His expression became serious, but not hostile, because most of the time, there's no one else to do it. Stella felt a pang in her chest when she heard those words, as if the loneliness in his voice was something she understood intimately. "That's not true," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "You have people around you who want to help. I want to help." The silence that followed was charged. William looked at her as if he were seeing something he had never noticed before. Something that disconcerted and at the same time attracted him. "I know," he said finally, his voice soft but full of meaning. Stella felt her heart accelerate. There was something in his eyes, a flame that seemed to reflect what she herself felt, but she didn't have the courage to admit it. She stood up slowly, hesitant but determined. "William, Stella." The names came out simultaneously, as if they were the same word, the same thought. Before she could think or rationalize, Stella took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The smell of his perfume became stronger, mixing with the faint scent of coffee in the air. And then, it happened. The kiss was unexpected, but overwhelming. At first it was tentative, as if they were both testing their limits, but it quickly became something deeper, more urgent. William's hands wrapped around Stella's waist, firm but gentle, while she held onto the front of his shirt, as if she needed something to anchor herself to. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the warmth they shared at that moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both panting, but they didn't pull away completely. Stella could feel the heat from William's body, and he, in turn, was still holding her waist, as if he didn't want to let go. "That," Stella began, but the words died in her throat. William looked at her, his eyes still filled with that intensity that seemed to burn. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, but the contradiction in his voice was evident. "No," Stella whispered, her eyes fixed on his. "Was it a mistake?" He was silent for a moment, his breathing still heavy. There was a clear conflict in his eyes, a struggle between reason and desire. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. Stella backed away, feeling her face burn. Her heart was in turmoil, and she needed to get out of there before her emotions consumed her. "I need to go," she murmured, hastily grabbing her bag. William stood there, watching her leave without saying a word. When the door closed, he ran a hand through his hair, still trying to understand what had happened. That night, as the lights of Manhattan continued to shine, something between William and Stella had changed forever. The silence of the office was no longer just an absence of sound, but the space between two people who knew their lives would never be the same again. Dawn brought a soft light that filtered through the imposing windows of the Carter Innovations building, tinting the white walls with an ephemeral golden glow. Outside, Manhattan was waking up at its usual frenetic pace, but inside William Carter's office, the silence seemed alive, almost oppressive. The air was permeated with a subtle aroma of coffee that was already cooling in a mug forgotten on the table. William sat in his leather chair, his normally impeccable posture now a little more slouched. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up, revealing tense arms, while his fingers turned the paper between them repetitively, as if each movement could offer an answer he didn't yet have. The note, simple and direct, seemed to weigh more than the paper itself. Give up on Orion or face the consequences. The writing was impersonal, cold, and mechanically typed, without any characteristic that could identify the sender. However, the threat did not require a signature. The meaning was clear and cut like a sharp blade. It wasn't just about him or the project. It was about everything he had built. About Stella. William's jaw clenched as he pondered. The anger was a hot flame burning beneath the surface, but with it came a growing concern. The feeling of being cornered was not new, but this time the weight felt greater. The office door opened with a discreet click, and Linda entered. She wore an impeccably tailored dark blue suit, her low-heeled shoes making a steady, rhythmic sound on the floor. The expression on her face was serious, but not alarmist. Linda had always known how to balance efficiency and control, even when faced with critical situations. "Did you call me?" she asked, closing the door carefully and taking a few steps forward. William stood up, handing him the note. His eyes never left her face as she read, following every micro-expression. The slight frown of her eyebrows and the way she pursed her lips showed that she took this as seriously as he did. "Is that what I think it is?" Linda asked, her voice low but sharp. "It seems so," William replied, leaning back on the edge of the table, his arms crossed over his chest in an attempt to contain the tension that was bubbling inside him. "They are getting bolder." Linda looked at the note again, her eyes analyzing every detail as if they could extract something more from the short words. Finally, she placed the paper on the table. "We have to report this to the authorities. We cannot ignore it." "That's exactly what they want," William replied, with a firmer tone. "If the police get involved, the media will find out. The last thing we need right now is a public scandal involving Orion." Linda watched him for a moment, her expression hardening. "William, I'm not just worried about the company. I'm worried about you. And with Stella." Stella's name fell into the room like a stone thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that William tried unsuccessfully to ignore. He looked out the window, watching the first rays of sunlight reflecting off the adjacent buildings. "She's in danger, isn't she?" Linda insisted, her voice lower but cutting like a knife. William looked back at her, his jaw tense before finally responding. "Yes, Jonathan Blake will not stop until he destroys everything in his path." Linda leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "And what do you intend to do?" William took a deep breath, as if seeking strength from the air around him. "I will protect her, even if it means facing Jonathan directly." Linda knew there was nothing more to say. When William made a decision, there was no room for discussion. Later, Stella was sitting at her desk, a mug of coffee in her hands. The floral perfume she wore seemed to compete with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, creating a comforting mix amid the tension that dominated the room. His attention was on a report in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. Since the kiss with William, something had changed between them. It was as if each interaction, each exchange of glances, carried a new weight, something they both recognized but didn't have the courage to address. When William came out of his office and walked towards her, Stella immediately realized that something was wrong. He had that hard expression, but his eyes betrayed an emotional weariness she rarely saw. "We can talk?" he asked, his voice low but full of intensity. Stella put the mug on the table and stood up without hesitation. "Of course." They walked together to the meeting room, where William closed the door behind him. He looked hesitant for a moment before handing her the note. Stella read it quickly, and her expression changed from curiosity to concern in a matter of seconds. "This is serious, William. Do you think it was Jonathan?" "I have no doubts." She placed the note on the table, crossing her arms as she tried to contain the mixture of fear and indignation that was rising inside her. "And what does that mean? What are you going to do?" William took a step towards her, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "I will continue with the project. I will not back down because of a threat." "And me?" asked Stella, her voice shaking slightly. "They know I'm here, don't they?" "Yes," he replied, bluntly. "And that's why I need you to trust me. I'll make sure you're safe no matter what." His tone was so firm, so definitive, that Stella felt a lump in her throat. There was something about his determination that was both comforting and frightening. In the following days, the threats continued. Encrypted messages arrived in the company's emails, and envelopes with no return address began to appear at reception. The atmosphere at Carter Innovations became more tense, with security guards roaming the hallways and uneasy looks among employees. The aroma of coffee seemed stronger, almost bitter, reflecting the heavy mood that hung in the air. Despite William's attempts to protect her, Stella knew she was at the center of something much bigger. Jonathan Blake was not just an adversary, he was a living reminder of everything she tried to leave behind. One night, while Stella was organizing her documents, William appeared beside her. He was visibly tired, but there was a gleam in his eyes that showed determination. "Let's get out of here," he said abruptly. "What?" asked Stella, confused. "You need a break." "Me too. Come with me." Without giving her a chance to protest, he led her out of the building. They walked through the brightly lit streets of Manhattan, the cool night air washing over them like a welcome relief after hours of tension. When they arrived at a small coffee shop, Stella felt a wave of calm. The sweet aroma of hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies filled the space, a perfect contrast to recent events. "We needed this," said William, with a rare smile as he held a cup of coffee. "I agree," Stella replied, looking at him differently. In that brief moment, away from the threats and chaos, something changed between them. It wasn't just a moment of peace. It was the beginning of something deeper. They both knew the challenge ahead would be great, but for the first time, they knew they would face it together. Dawn in Manhattan brought a faint and welcoming light, a mix of orange and gold tones that painted the sky and were reflected in the glass of the skyscrapers. On the 47th floor of the Carter Innovations building, this light found its way through the large windows, casting a soft momentary glow on the white walls. However, inside the office, the atmosphere was far from tranquil. The air was warm, filled with the strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the dry smell of printed paper, mixed with the subtle woodsy perfume that William Carter wore. He was standing next to the glass wall, his eyes fixed on the city below. He held a ceramic mug with the company logo in one hand, but the coffee had long since cooled, forgotten. His gaze was lost, fixed on the moving streets below, but his thoughts went far beyond the landscape. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of problems and threats, and although he maintained his composure for his team, there was an uneasiness growing within him. The sound of Linda's steady footsteps brought him out of his immersion. She entered the room with a bulky folder in hand, her posture straight and professional as always. She wore a black suit that contrasted with the impeccable whiteness of her blouse, and her low-heeled shoes echoed through the silent space. "One more report, Mr. Carter," she said, placing the folder on the table. William nodded his thanks, but didn't open the report right away. His eyes wandered around the room until he found Stella Monroe's desk, visible through the glass partition. She was sitting, bent over her computer screen, typing with a concentration that seemed impenetrable. Next to the keyboard, an open notebook displayed handwritten notes, scribbled hastily while a pen twirled between his fingers between one thought and another. Her hair was tied up in a hasty bun, with a few loose strands falling down her face, and she wore a simple but elegant dress that highlighted her professional demeanor. Even from a distance, the floral perfume she wore seemed to cut through the charged air of the office, reaching William as a constant reminder of his presence. He felt something in his chest, a confusing feeling that he hesitated to name, but that seemed to grow every day. The previous day had been exhausting. The threats to Carter Innovations were intensifying. The messages were becoming more frequent and explicit. Each problem seemed to multiply, but curiously, William felt a renewed strength within him, as if he was facing the chaos more steadfastly than usual. Part of it, he knew, came from Stella. She demonstrated determination he hadn't anticipated, a strength that went beyond her role as assistant. With a short sigh, William placed the mug on the table and left his room, walking towards Stella's desk. The sound of his footsteps on the dense carpet was almost imperceptible, and she only realized his presence when he cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the low murmur of the office. "Stella, I need you in the meeting room," he said, his usual firm tone, but without the coldness of other occasions. She looked up at him, surprised for a moment, but then nodded. Her expression changed from concentration to readiness as she picked up the notebook. The click of the pen as it was ready for use cut through the silence as she followed, and the faint smell of fresh ink brought a familiarity to the moment. In the meeting room, William closed the door behind him and walked to the table. He opened his laptop and adjusted the projector, which cast a bright light on the opposite wall. The cold lights above them illuminated the room impersonally, but Stella's gaze was fixed on what he was beginning to display. A digital map appeared on the screen, with connections drawn between different companies. In the center, the names Jonathan Blake and Titan Dynamics glowed in red. "This is what we are facing," William began, his voice full of gravity. "Titan Dynamics isn't just sabotaging Orion. They are systematically trying to destabilize Carter Innovations, and Jonathan Blake is the core of it all." Stella felt a shiver run down her spine when she heard Jonathan's name, but she maintained her posture. Her face, however, couldn't completely hide the worry she felt. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice sounding firm, but with a subtle hesitation that only William noticed. "I need your help to cross-reference information. You know Jonathan better than anyone here. He is methodical but impulsive. I need to understand how he thinks." Stella pondered for a moment, looking at the map on the screen. Each red line felt like a tangible threat, a reminder of Jonathan's reach and ability to manipulate situations. "Okay," she said, after a long silence. His voice was firm now, charged with renewed determination. "I'll do it." The next few hours passed in a blur of intense work. William and Stella delved into the files, tracking patterns, analyzing suspicious transactions, and discussing strategy. The smell of coffee became a constant companion, mixing with the scent of paper warmed by the light from the lamp that William had brought into the room. "He always used intermediaries," Stella said, her voice cutting through the silence as her eyes remained fixed on the screen. "But he has a weakness. In the end, he always trusts someone too much. That's how you catch him. It makes a game piece feel too powerful." William watched as she spoke, his eyes fixed on her more than the screen. There was a passion in her voice, an energy he rarely saw in other people. "Have you ever thought about leading an investigation team?" he asked with a tone that bordered on joking. Stella laughed softly, a brief but genuine laugh that brought unexpected warmth to the cold room. "I think it's complicated enough being your assistant." They exchanged a look, and for a moment, the work was forgotten. The silence that followed was different, more charged. Something invisible seemed to hover between them, something neither of them knew how to name or deal with. William looked away first, breaking the tension. Back to work. But as he spoke, the feeling persisted, a silent idea he couldn't shake. There was something about Stella that attracted him in a way he wasn't prepared to face. When the office finally fell silent that night, Stella was still there, reviewing one last file. The smell of cold coffee in the mug next to her mixed with the aroma of her floral perfume, creating an atmosphere of tiredness, but also of accomplishment. William appeared beside her again, this time with 2 cups of hot coffee. He placed one next to her without saying a word and sat in the opposite chair. "You should go home," he said, his voice softer than usual. "And you?" Stella asked with a small smile that lit up her tired face. "I'm never going home," he replied, with a hint of humor in his voice, but something truthful in his words. Stella watched him for a moment, seeing past his strong, confident exterior. "Maybe you should try." William gave a small smile in response, but didn't respond. Instead, he took a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth of the liquid ease some of the weight on his shoulders. At that time, there were no threats or sabotage, just the soft sound of their breathing and the faint scent of coffee filling the space between them. The sky over Manhattan was covered in gray clouds that morning, as if the city reflected the invisible weight that hung over those who inhabited it. The bustling streets and continuous sound of horns contrasted with the atmosphere inside Carter Innovations, where a quiet tension permeated the air. The constant buzz of keyboards being pressed and phone calls being answered barely disguised the anxiety that seemed to spread throughout the space. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the slightly chemical smell of printed paper, filling the room with a bittersweet sense of routine and haste. Stella Monroe sat at her desk, her hair tied into a low ponytail, with a few strands falling softly across her face. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated her expression of concentration as she reviewed the reports William had requested. No matter how hard he tried to stay focused, his mind wandered. The events of the last few weeks seemed to have transformed everything. The growing tension, the threats that surrounded Orion, and mainly, the relationship with William. He remained the methodical, ruthless CEO. But there were moments brief but revealing when Stella sensed a vulnerability that he worked hard to hide. It was as if behind that facade of absolute control, there was an unhealed wound, something that moved him and at the same time, destroyed him. Stella was so absorbed in these thoughts that she didn't notice William approaching. "Stella," he called, his voice firm, but without its usual stiffness. She looked up, meeting his. There was something in his expression that made her straighten up immediately. "Trying? I need you to come with me." "Now?" she asked, surprised by the direct tone. "Now," he replied, already walking away towards the meeting room. Stella took her notebook and followed William, feeling the light woodsy scent of his perfume wafting through the air as they walked. As they entered the meeting room, the atmosphere seemed to change. The white lights reflected off the shiny surfaces of the glass table, creating a cold, impersonal atmosphere that contrasted with the emotional weight Stella felt. William closed the door behind her and motioned for her to sit down. On the table was a single folder. The paper yellowed around the edges, indicating that it had been handled countless times. William didn't sit down. He remained standing, hands firmly resting on the back of a chair, as his eyes fixed on the folder, as if it were an enemy he needed to confront. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice lower than usual. Stella placed the notebook on the table and sat up straighter, feeling that the moment was more important than any other they had shared so far. "Do you trust me, Stella?" The question took her by surprise. She expected an explanation or instructions, but not that. Even so, his response was immediate. "I trust." William nodded slowly, as if her response was a weight he was preparing to carry. He opened the suitcase and pushed it towards Stella. At first she hesitated, but finally looked at the contents. There were photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all centered on a single name: Thomas Carter. "Thomas Carter," William began, his voice with a tone of sadness that Stella had never heard before, "was my older brother." Stella looked at him in surprise. William rarely mentioned his family, and she never imagined he had a brother. "He was brilliant," William continued, finally sitting down in the opposite chair, "a software engineer with a mind few could match. He worked at a startup that was developing a revolutionary technology for cybersecurity." As he spoke, his eyes seemed distant, as if he were revisiting painful memories he had long avoided. Titan Dynamics discovered the project, and they wanted it. The tone of his voice changed, now filled with suppressed anger. "My brother refused their offer. He believed that technology should be accessible, not controlled by a greedy corporation." Stella saw the tension in his shoulders increase as he paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "So they used another tactic. They sabotaged the systems, manipulated data, and when the startup failed to meet deadlines, they bought it for a fraction of its real value." Stella's eyes were fixed on William, absorbing every word. She could feel the weight of his pain, as if each syllable carried years of frustration and regret. "My brother couldn't handle it. He believed he had failed everyone around him." "What happened to him?" asked Stella, her voice softer than she intended. William looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw something she had never imagined: pure vulnerability. "He took his own life." The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Stella felt a lump in her throat, but she couldn't say anything. William's gaze was fixed on the empty spot before him, but she knew he was reliving everything in his mind. "That's why you're so focused on Orion," she said finally, her voice full of understanding. "You want to defeat them." William nodded, but there was more in his eyes. "It's not just that. I want to prove that they can't step on people and get away with it. Carter Innovations has to be a symbol of resistance, something that represents the opposite of everything they are." For a long moment, Stella was silent. For the first time, she saw the real William Carter, the man behind the ruthless CEO mask. He wasn't just someone driven by ambition. He was someone who carried the pain of a devastating loss, turning it into a motivating but also consuming force. "William, you don't have to carry this alone." He gave a short but humorless laugh. "It's not that simple. Maybe it is. You just need to learn to trust people." William looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the air in the room seem thicker. "I trust you, Stella." The words were simple, but loaded with meaning. Stella felt an inexplicable warmth in her chest, something that left her speechless. "And that's why I need you to stay by my side." Stella nodded, knowing that conversation changed everything between them. It wasn't just about Orion or the threats. It was about something deeper, something that created an unbreakable bond between the two. As the day continued and the sounds of the office returned to their usual frenetic pace, Stella knew she was carrying a new weight. It wasn't just the work. It was the responsibility to be by William's side, not just as an assistant, but as someone he trusted. And that, more than anything, made her want to fight. The Hotel Astoria's ballroom was a breathtaking sight, like a setting carefully designed to exude luxury and power. Crystal chandeliers hung majestically from the vaulted ceiling, reflecting gold and silver lights dancing off the polished marble walls. The delicate clink of champagne glasses and the enveloping sound of a string quartet gave the environment an almost magical aura. There was a faint fragrance of freshly arranged flowers, mixed with the subtle smell of expensive perfumes, a combination that seemed to float among the guests, accentuating the sophistication of the event. Stella Monroe stood for a moment at the edge of the room, adjusting the pearl necklace around her neck with careful fingers. Her black satin dress flowed like water, molding perfectly to her body. The fabric glowed softly under the lights, highlighting her figure with an elegance that seemed to defy the critical eyes around her. But unlike her days of red carpet glamour, her eyes now carried a determination that transformed her presence into something more than just beauty. Beside her, William Carter radiated authority and control. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and the slight shine on the silver cufflinks added a touch of luxury to his already imposing figure. The golden light of the room highlighted the sharp lines of her face, and the woodsy citrus scent of her perfume seemed to match her meticulous personality perfectly. "Nervous?" he asked, without looking away from a group of business people who were talking on the other side of the room. "Not the right word," Stella replied, her tone controlled as a small smile curved her lips. "I think alert describes it better." William nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful. His eyes scanned the room as if it were a chessboard, each person a piece he needed to consider. "Remember," he said, his voice low but firm, "what Jonathan wants most is for you to lose control. Don't give it to him." Stella took a deep breath, the fresh air mixed with the scent of flowers lightly comforting her. "I know," he replied, his voice soft but determined. It didn't take long for Jonathan Blake's entrance to steal the attention. He walked into the room like he owned the place, radiating an arrogant confidence that Stella knew all too well. His light gray suit looked tailored, reflecting an understated glow under the lights. His smile, a combination of calculated charm and implied threat, was as sharp as his presence. The citrus perfume he always wore, a signature Stella had tried to forget, seemed to invade the space around her, bringing back memories she would rather leave buried. His body tensed and his heart raced with a mixture of anger and discomfort. Jonathan saw her almost instantly, and his eyes sparkled with a satisfaction that made her feel as if she were once again under his control. He walked towards her with slow, deliberate steps, ignoring the other guests in his path. William noticed the movement immediately and took a step forward, positioning himself between Jonathan and Stella like a human shield. "Stella, what a pleasant surprise," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And alongside William Carter, no less. You really know how to choose your companies." "Blake," William replied, his voice as firm as steel. "I hope you're enjoying your evening." Jonathan chuckled softly, but there was something predatory in his laugh. "Oh, I am, Carter. More than you imagine." William kept his gaze fixed on Jonathan, his expression calm but unwavering. "That's good to hear," he said, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm always satisfied when my competitors are comfortable. This usually means they don't realize the risks they are taking." Jonathan's smile faltered for a brief moment before turning his attention back to Stella. "Stella, you really found an interesting protector. But tell me, how long do you think he'll stay by your side when he finds out everything?" The words hung in the air like a veiled threat. Stella felt heat rise to her neck, but she maintained her composure, crossing her arms defensively. "Everything?" she replied, her voice firm but full of tension. Jonathan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to something almost intimate. "You know what I'm talking about. Not all secrets can stay buried forever." Before Stella could respond, William interrupted, his voice sharp. "If you're trying to be cryptic, Blake, you're failing miserably." Jonathan raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Don't worry, Carter. I have no intention of ruining the night." Yet, he took a step back, but not before giving Stella one last look. A look that said more than his words. "Enjoy it while you can." When Jonathan finally pulled away, Stella let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. His shoulders were tense, and his face was slightly pale. William turned to her, his eyes scanning her quickly, as if searching for any signs of weakness. "Are you well?" "I don't know," Stella admitted, crossing her arms tightly, as if trying to protect herself from Jonathan's words. "Don't believe anything he says," William stated, his tone serious and almost protective. "I know," Stella said, but there was a hesitation in her voice that betrayed her doubts. Minutes later, William was called to the stage to give a speech. Stella watched him as he walked confidently, each step meticulously calculated. His suit seemed like an extension of his authority, and his posture radiated control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice filling the room with a clarity that captured everyone's attention. "Tonight is not just a celebration of our successes, but a reminder of what we are capable of achieving together." Stella listened intently, but her eyes wandered to the back of the room, where Jonathan was in animated conversation with a select group of guests. Something about the way he gestured and laughed bothered her. It was as if he was orchestrating something, invisible to everyone but her. When William got off the stage, Stella pulled him aside, her hand lightly touching his arm to get his attention. "Jonathan is up to something," she said, her voice low but urgent. William looked in the direction she indicated, his gaze narrowing as he assessed Jonathan from afar. "Let him try. I'm prepared." Although William said this with confidence, they both knew that the confrontation was far from over. That night, as they left the event, the cold air of Manhattan enveloped them as a reminder of the harsh reality that awaited them outside that luxurious ballroom. In the car, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Stella broke the silence. "Do you think he knows something that could harm us?" William turned to her, his expression serious, but his eyes contained a touch of softness. "Even if he knows, he won't win. Not while we're in this together." William's words were simple, but filled with a certainty that Stella felt deeply. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that, despite everything, they had a chance to win. The day began with the Manhattan sky tinged with gray, reflecting a gloom that seemed to presage the events to come. At Carter Innovations, it was bustling as usual, but there was something in the air, perhaps an invisible heaviness, as if employees sensed something was about to happen. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the faint smell of ink from printed documents. But it couldn't mask the tension that was slowly building. William Carter was in his office, surrounded by stacks of reports and the cold glow of his laptop. His concentration was interrupted when Richard hurried in, his face pale and an expression of urgency that didn't need words to convey gravity. "Mr. Carter, we need you to look into this immediately." William took the tablet that Richard handed him, and as he looked at the screen, his expression hardened. The wrinkles on his forehead deepened as he read the headline that seemed to scream from the digital letters. "Fallen actress or corporate saboteur? Stella Monroe accused of conspiring against Carter Innovations." The article was full of fabricated information, but presented with a level of sophistication that bordered on Machiavellian. There were alleged emails from Stella to Titan Dynamics representatives, detailing strategies to undermine the Orion project. Forged screenshots, fake messages, and even a fictitious history of secret meetings completed the scenario. The narrative was so well constructed that it was easy to imagine that many people would believe it. William felt a surge of anger mixed with concern. The air conditioning blew a chilly breeze, but he felt an uncomfortable heat building in his chest. He clenched his fists, his jaw clenched as he analyzed every detail of the story. A few minutes later, Linda entered the room. She had a folder full of documents, and her look reflected the same concern that now dominated William. "This is serious, William," she said, placing the folder on the table. His voice was firm, but there was a note of uneasiness. "The matter is already spreading quickly, and it doesn't help that shareholders started calling." "Shareholders?" William looked up, the irritation noticeable in his tone. "I received 5 calls this morning alone. They want to know why Stella Monroe is involved in Orion and whether the accusations have any basis." William took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation increase. He knew that it wasn't just Stella who was under attack. The article was a direct blow to Carter Innovations, an attempt to destabilize the Orion project and its reputation. "I want this investigated immediately," he said, his voice as firm as steel. "We will not make any decisions based on rumors." Linda nodded, but the look in her eyes said she knew how delicate this was. "And Stella?" she asked. William didn't respond right away. He looked away to the glass door that led to the rest of the office. From his office, he could see Stella sitting at her desk, focused on her tasks. She seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around her, but he knew it wouldn't last long. After a few minutes, William stood up, determined. He crossed the office with firm steps, the sound of his shoes echoing on the floor and cutting into the silence that was beginning to grow among the employees. Many had already seen the article and looked furtively at Stella, who still didn't understand the reason for the whispers around her. "Stella," William called, stopping next to his table. She looked up at him, surprised by the deep tone in his voice. What it was. "Come with me." Without asking questions, Stella took out her notebook and followed him to the meeting room. As soon as they entered, William closed the door, the click echoing in the silent room. He handed her the tablet without saying a word. Stella frowned as she began to read, but as her eyes swept over the words on the screen, her expression changed. Confusion gave way to shock, which soon turned to outrage. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is all a lie." "I know," William replied, but his calm voice was not enough to reassure her. "Who would do that?" asked Stella, almost in disbelief. "Jonathan Blake," he replied without hesitation. Stella squeezed the tablet tightly, as if she wanted to destroy it. His hands were shaking, but it was difficult to tell whether from anger or frustration. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she asked, her eyes filled with a mixture of fury and despair. "Not as long as I believe he can reach me using you." Stella stood up abruptly, crossing her arms as she walked across the room. The dress she was wearing seemed to be tighter than usual, as if the clothes themselves were trying to suffocate her. "I need to do something. I need to tell the truth. Deny these accusations." "Stella, calm down," said William, his voice firm, but now with a softer tone. "Calm down?" She almost screamed. "How do you expect me to stay calm about this? They are painting me as a traitor." William took a step forward, approaching her. He placed his hands lightly on her shoulders, trying to convey a calmness that he himself struggled to feel. "I know it's difficult, but we need to be strategic. If we react impulsively, it will only fuel suspicion." Stella looked at him, her eyes shining with tears that she refused to let fall. "What if people believe? What if it destroys everything you're trying to build?" "You won't," William replied, his voice full of conviction. "Because I won't let you." Despite the words of support, the day remained tense. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting, and William spent hours answering pointed questions. With each response he gave in defense of Stella, he felt the suspicious looks of the council members. When night finally fell, William was alone in his room. The lights of Manhattan shone in the window, but they seemed further away than ever. He twirled the tablet in his hands, unable to shake thoughts of Stella and the devastating impact of the accusations. Meanwhile, Stella was at home, sitting on the couch with her tablet still in her hands. The headline flashed on the screen like a sentence. The soothing scent of chamomile tea that she had prepared seemed unable to calm her nerves. She was lost in thoughts, each one darker than the last, when her phone vibrated. William's name appeared on the screen, and she answered immediately. "William?" "We'll get through this, Stella," he said, directly and bluntly. The simple words carried a determination that somehow touched something deep within her. "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice low and full of doubt. "Because I trust you." And for the first time that day, Stella felt a spark of hope. Dawn brought an orange hue that seeped through the windows of the Carter Innovations office, reflecting off the glass and metal surfaces. The room, which usually vibrated with the sound of keyboards and incessant phone calls, was strangely quiet. It was as if everyone felt the weight of the crisis involving the company, especially those directly linked to the Orion project. William was in his living room, sitting behind his imposing dark wooden desk. In front of him, scattered papers and a laptop with a screen full of graphs and emails. The aroma of strong, bitter coffee filled the air, but he hadn't touched the mug in over an hour. His mind was torn between the responsibility of protecting the company and the nagging thought that perhaps he had made a mistake in doubting Stella. On the other side of the glass, Stella sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. Despite the constant air conditioning, she felt beads of sweat forming on her forehead. She knew the company was in crisis because of the allegations against her. Even though William had promised that the truth would prevail, she could feel the tension in her colleagues' gazes, in the conversations interrupted when she passed by. The smell of burning paper, coming from a nearby printer, was almost suffocating at that moment, intensifying the feeling of discomfort. Stella knew she needed to do something, not just to prove her innocence, but to show that she was still valuable to William and Orion. Then an email arrived in his inbox, marking the beginning of an unexpected opportunity. It was a message sent in error by a third-party supplier to Titan Dynamics. The content seemed trivial at first glance, but there was something about the numbers and dates that caught his attention. She began cross-referencing information with previous reports, and a pattern began to emerge. She grabbed her notebook and started making quick notes. The smell of fresh paint filled her nostrils as she scribbled connections between numbers and deadlines. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from nervousness. It was a growing excitement. She was close to discovering something important, something that could change the game. A short time later, Stella got up and walked determinedly to William's room. He looked up when she walked in without knocking, something she had never done before. "We need to talk," she said, placing the notebook on his desk. William narrowed his eyes, surprised by the direct tone. "What is that?" "Evidence," Stella replied, taking a deep breath. "Or at least a start." She quickly explained her findings, showing how Titan Dynamics had manipulated contracts and dates to create delays in the supply of essential materials for Orion. This, combined with the false data that had been leaked to the press, created the illusion of internal sabotage. William analyzed what she presented, his expression turning from skepticism to concentration. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the sound of paper being turned over and the clicks of his mouse as he checked the information on his laptop. "This," he began, finally looking up at Stella. "That makes sense." There was a tone of surprise and respect in his voice that Stella hadn't expected. "Of course you do," she said, crossing her arms. "Do you think I would sit around and wait to be brought down by lies?" A slight smile tugged a corner of William's lips, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Good answer," he said, "but we need more." "I've already thought about that," Stella replied, opening her notebook again. "If you can convene a meeting with the right suppliers and the most influential shareholders, we can present this data as part of a strategic defense." William nodded, impressed with the level of planning. "And you will be there with me?" he asked. Stella hesitated for a moment. "Do you trust me with this?" The question hung in the air like a shadow. William looked at her, and for the first time in days, his answer came without hesitation. Yes. The warmth of that word was enough to make Stella relax her shoulders for the first time since the accusations surfaced. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. They worked side by side, reviewing data, refining arguments, and rehearsing possible questions that might arise during the meeting. William was in control, as always, but there was something different about his posture. He listened carefully to Stella, trusting her ideas and integrating them into the plan. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room as they worked, and the sound of keyboard clicks was almost comforting. As the afternoon progressed, Stella realized that despite the intensity of the moment, there was something satisfying about their collaboration. It was as if they were finally on the same page, facing the same enemy together. The following morning, the meeting took place in a private room in the Carter Innovations building itself. The white lights above shone brightly, reflecting off the serious faces of the shareholders and suppliers present. William was impeccably dressed, his dark blue tie symbolizing control and confidence. Stella, next to him, wore a black blazer that gave her a posture of authority that even she didn't know she had. William opened the meeting with his usual direct and imposing tone, but it was Stella who stole the show. When it was her turn to present the evidence, she spoke with a clarity and firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including William. She pointed out discrepancies in contracts, highlighted patterns that revealed sabotage, and connected each dot precisely. The silence at the end of his presentation was quickly broken by murmurs of approval. One of the shareholders, an older man with a stern expression, stood up. "Miss Monroe, this analysis is brilliant. Why haven't we seen this before?" "Maybe because I needed to prove that I deserved to be heard," Stella replied, with a slight smile. William watched the interaction, feeling something stir inside him. He knew that, at many times, he had been guilty of underestimating her. But there, in that room, he realized how indispensable Stella was, not just for Orion, but for him. When the meeting ended, with shareholders clearly satisfied and suppliers aligned, William and Stella returned to the office. As soon as the door to her room closed, William turned to her. "You saved the day, Stella." She smiled, still feeling the adrenaline of the moment. "I just did what needed to be done." "No, you did more than that." The intensity in his voice made her look at him more closely. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before, something softer, more open. "I was wrong to doubt you," he said, his voice low, "and I won't make that mistake again." Stella felt heat rise to her face, but she maintained her composure. "Good, because I don't plan on going anywhere." They exchanged a smile, and in that moment, something changed between them. It wasn't just a matter of professional trust. It was something deeper, a partnership that somehow made them feel like they could face anything together. The day was bright, but the golden light that flooded the wide windows of the Carter Innovations building seemed unable to dispel the heaviness that hung in the air. Inside William Carter's office, the atmosphere was filled with an almost palpable tension, as if the space itself was preparing for something monumental. The corridors, normally full of voices and suppressed laughter, were silent, interrupted only by the sound of William's determined footsteps. He walked steadily, a sealed envelope in his hands. The white paper was rough to the touch, and the sheer weight of the object seemed to carry the fate of everything he had worked for. William had spent the night before reviewing the confidential reports his security team had gathered. Now, in his hands was the proof he needed to change the course of events. Upon entering his room, he closed the door with a decisive movement, the click echoing like an end to his thoughts. The woodsy scent of her perfume mixed with the familiar scent of the leather of her chair and the fresh ink of the reports that had been printed earlier. The combination was usually comforting, but at this moment, it only intensified his concentration. He sat down and opened the envelope carefully. The sound of the seal tearing seemed louder in the absolute silence. Inside, the evidence was undeniable: compromising financial transactions, leaked emails, and a short but devastating video of Jonathan Blake in a restaurant discussing strategy with a Titan Dynamics representative. William analyzed every detail with a cold gaze, but the heat of controlled anger rose through his body. Jonathan had not only tried to destroy his project, he had also manipulated Stella, turning her into a pawn in his sick game. Her name appeared on one of the documents, associated with a broader plan. It was clear Jonathan planned to use her again, as a disposable tool in his quest for power. For a moment, William closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt the weight of his responsibility, not just with your company, but with Stella. He knew he needed to protect her, no matter the cost. Minutes later, he called Stella into his office. When she entered, the light floral scent of her perfume softened the atmosphere, but failed to dispel the gravity of the situation. Her eyes, so expressive, showed concern, even before she said a word. "Did you want to talk to me?" she asked, her voice firm but hesitant. William hesitated for a moment before pushing the envelope towards him. "You need to see this." Stella took the envelope, her hands slightly trembling, and began to read the documents. With each page, his expression changed. First, confusion, then shock, and finally, a suppressed anger that seemed to boil within her. "I knew he was involved," she murmured, as if speaking more to herself than to William. But this is worse than I imagined." When she looked up, William saw something deeper, pain mixed with determination. "He needs to be stopped," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised him. "And it will be," replied William, crossing his arms. "But we need to be careful. This cannot be done impulsively." Stella shook her head, but her expression hardened even more. "William, there is something you need to know." "What is it?" She took a deep breath, as if summoning all the courage she possessed. "Jonathan, he won't stop until he completely destroys me. He already did it once, and now he's trying it again. But I won't let it." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, I'm going to tell the truth. I will confront him publicly." Her words hung in the air, full of intensity. William was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on hers. "You know the risk this represents, don't you?" "I know," she replied, her voice firm. "But I can't continue living in fear. If he wants to use my reputation against me, then I'll turn the tables. I will expose everything he did, not just to me, but to you and Orion." William took a step forward, the intensity of his gaze reflecting the same strength he saw in her. "If you do that, he will react. He is not the type of man who accepts being exposed without a fight." "I know," she said, her voice lower, but as determined as before. "But I'm not alone this time." Stella's words hit him unexpectedly. She trusted him. It made him realize that he also trusted her more than anyone. Over the next few days, they worked together tirelessly to organize a press conference. The evidence was reviewed and categorized, the details adjusted to ensure that each accusation was irrefutable. They knew the battle would not end there, but they were determined to strike the first blow. The night before the press conference, Stella was at home, sitting at her dressing table. The reflection in the mirror showed a tense face, but there was a renewed strength in his eyes. The black dress she would wear the next day hung next to it, and the faint scent of lavender from the fabric filled the room. When the phone rang, she answered it immediately, seeing William's name on the screen. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" he asked, his voice deep but comforting. "I think so," she replied, trying to sound confident. "You'll come out of this stronger than you came in, Stella. I promise." She felt tears forming, but took a deep breath, holding them back. "Thank you, William, for everything." The next morning, the Carter Innovations conference hall was packed with journalists. The metallic smell of the equipment, mixed with the aroma of paper and fresh ink from the printers, creating a sense of urgency in the air. William and Stella were backstage, ready to enter. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking at her intensely. "More than ever," she replied, straightening her shoulders. When they entered, the hall fell into an expectant silence. Stella walked to the pulpit, with William by her side, and began to speak. Her voice was steady, clear, and each word carried the weight of the truth she was finally ready to reveal. She calmly and precisely laid out how Jonathan had manipulated her career, sabotaged Orion, and used his influence to try to destroy everything she loved. The evidence, projected on a screen behind her, was undeniable, and the journalists were stunned. When she finished, the room erupted in questions, but William guided her out firmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. That night, as they watched the repercussions on television, William looked at Stella and smiled. "You were incredible today." She returned the smile, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I couldn't have done this without you." They didn't say anything else, but the silence that followed was comfortable, filled with an understanding that needed no words. For the first time, they both felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Morning dawned under a gray, heavy sky, the kind of day when the sunlight seemed like a distant whisper hidden behind thick clouds. The light rain fell slowly, covering New York with a brilliant veil that reflected the lights of traffic lights and car headlights. Inside the Carter Innovations building, the mood was as gloomy as the sky outside. The muffled sound of William Carter's footsteps echoed faintly through the marble hallways, but the normally vibrant atmosphere was quiet, almost expectant. He held a manila envelope in one hand, his fingers clenched around the paper, as if trying to crush the reality contained within. The usual aroma of freshly brewed coffee was present, but it seemed distant, unable to break through the weight that enveloped it. His eyes, fixed on the company logo on the glass wall in front of him, carried a dark intensity, as if he saw not only the present, but also everything that was at risk. Upon entering his room, William closed the door with a deliberate movement. The smell of leather from the chair and the woody perfume he wore created a familiar atmosphere. But at that moment, even that seemed different, heavier. He placed the envelope on the table, but didn't open it right away. I already knew what it contained. The resignation that Jonathan Blake had demanded. The price of protecting Stella and everything she stood for. A few minutes later, Stella entered the room. Her steps were tentative, and she held a mug of coffee, the steam slowly rising in spirals. The warm, comforting smell contrasted with the cold, heavy environment. His face was serene, but his eyes, always so expressive, betrayed the concern he felt. "Did you call me?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. William looked up, locking it with hers for a moment before responding. "Listen, Stella." She complied, placing the mug on the table. The sound of glass against wood echoed softly in the room, but neither of them seemed to notice. "What is happening?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, uneasiness growing in her tone. William took a deep breath, taking the envelope and sliding it across the table towards her. "This is happening." Stella took the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to read the contents. With each line he read, his expression changed. First curiosity, then shock, and finally sadness and indignation. "William, you can't do this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's not a question of whether you want it or not. It is necessary." "Necessary?" Stella looked up, her eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. "Jonathan won't stop, Stella. He's made it clear that if I continue in his path, you will be the next target." She shook her head, her eyes shining with tears that she refused to let fall. "No, that's not right. He cannot force you to give up everything you have worked for." William leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "This is not a withdrawal. It's a strategy." "Strategy?" she repeated, almost laughing in disbelief. "You are handing over your position as CEO, William. This is more than a strategy. It's temporary," he said, his voice firm but betraying a deep weariness. "I'll be back when things calm down." Stella was silent, the paper still in her hands. The printed words were cold, but the weight of them was crushing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. William looked up to meet her. For a moment, the world seemed to go silent around them. "Because protecting you is more important." The words hung in the air, filled with a sincerity that Stella hadn't expected. A single tear escaped her eyes, tracing a silent path down her cheek before she hastily wiped it away. "I don't deserve this," she murmured, her voice almost breaking. "Yes, you deserve it," he replied, without hesitation. Stella took a deep breath, trying to contain the emotions that threatened to overflow. She knew he was doing this for her, but she also knew how much it was costing him. "If you do this, I promise I will help you get everything back," she said, her voice filled with determination. William kept his gaze fixed on her, his words carrying a firm tone. "I'm not asking for anything, Stella. I just want you to be safe." She stood up, leaning slightly on the table to look at him more closely. "And I want you to get back what's yours." Her voice was firm, but there was a heat in it that he couldn't ignore. "You won't face this alone. I promise." The silence that followed was filled with understanding, a connection that didn't need words. At the end of the day, William signed the papers. The pen, heavy in his hand, seemed a symbol of the weight he carried. The sound of the tip sliding across the paper echoed in the room, as if marking the end of a chapter in his life. When he was done, he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the magnitude of what he had just done. Later, Stella found him at the entrance of the building. The rain was still falling, painting the sidewalk with reflections of the city lights. The fresh smell of wet earth mixed with her floral scent, creating a combination that felt strangely comforting. She held an umbrella, opening it as they walked to the car together. "Are you well?" she asked, looking at him softly. "No," he answered honestly, "but I will be." She smiled slightly, a small smile, but full of hope. "I'll guarantee it." In the car, the silence between them was different from before, deeper and more comfortable, as if the battle they faced united them even more. As the lights of Manhattan shone through the windows, they both knew the road ahead would be arduous, but for the first time, They were sure they wouldn't face this alone. William's office was immersed in a dense silence, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling outside, pressing on the window panes as if it wanted to enter. The dark gray sky, filled with clouds, announced an imminent storm, and the cold light streaming through the windows gave the room an austere tone. The woody aroma of William's perfume, always present, mixed with the light metallic smell of the corporate environment, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere of intensity. Stella was sitting at the conference table, her short nails tapping rhythmically on the glass top. His eyes were fixed on William, who was typing on his laptop with fierce concentration. His rigid posture and the tense muscles in his neck revealed the seriousness of the moment. The sound of keys being pressed echoed through the room, each click seeming to carry the weight of the responsibility they both felt. "Something?" Stella asked, her voice a little lower than she intended, as if she didn't want to completely break the silence. William didn't respond right away. He continued typing for a few more seconds, his eyebrows furrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he stopped, leaned back in his chair, and rubbed his eyes with his hands. "We have something solid," he said, his voice low and marked by accumulated fatigue. He swung the laptop toward Stella, revealing detailed graphs, screenshots, and a long series of financial transactions. Each dot on the screen was a piece of a carefully assembled puzzle, exposing the extent of Jonathan Blake and Titan Dynamics schemes. "Not only did they sabotage Orion," William explained, pointing to one of the charts with his finger, "but they also used confidential information to manipulate investors and divert lucrative contracts." Stella leaned forward, her breathing slightly quickened as she examined every detail on the screen. The coffee she had brought still gave off its rich, familiar aroma, but now it seemed like an insignificant distraction from what was before her. "That's more than enough to unmask them," Stella said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. William crossed his arms, his gaze remaining fixed on the screen for a moment before shifting to her. "Maybe," he said, his tone cautious, "but we need to be careful. Jonathan still has all eyes, and Titan Dynamics isn't going down without a fight." The glow of excitement dimmed a little in Stella's eyes, replaced by a dark understanding. She knew William was right. Jonathan was cunning, manipulative, and his connections were powerful. "So what do we do?" she asked, straightening up in her chair, her posture now reflecting determination. William took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "We need to come up with a plan that leaves no room for doubt, and we need to do this together." The room became a strategic battlefield. Papers were spread across the table, graphs were projected on the wall, and notes filled sheets that seemed unable to keep up with the pace of his ideas. The constant sound of William's keyboard mixed with Stella scribbling quick notes in her notebook, creating a frantic but coordinated rhythm. Stella had a peculiar way of seeing patterns that William had ignored, connecting points that seemed disconnected. In turn, William organized the information with surgical precision, structuring the plan in an irrefutable way. As they worked, their collaboration became more fluid, almost intuitive. "You realize we're getting good at this, right?" Stella said, a tired but genuine smile emerging as she ran a hand through her messy hair. William looked up, allowing himself a small smile, a rare thing that softened his sharp features. "Maybe we're a good team after all." There was something in his words that made Stella's heart race for a brief moment. It wasn't just professional recognition, it was validation she didn't know how much she needed. When the clock passed midnight, the two finally finished organizing the strategy. Stella was leaning over the table, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on William as he gathered the documents into an organized folder. "Everything ready?" she asked, her voice tired but satisfied. "Ready," replied William, closing the folder carefully. "Tomorrow, we start implementing it." Stella nodded slowly, but made no move to leave. Her eyes remained on him, and something in her gaze seemed deeper than simple relief at the progress made. "William," she began, hesitating. He looked up, straightening up in his chair. "Trying? Thanks for trusting me." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken meanings. William kept his gaze fixed on hers, his expression softening a little. "I trust you, Stella, more than anyone else." The air felt hotter, thicker, as the two stared at each other. There was something in that moment that neither of them was ready to verbalize, but they both felt. Finally, Stella gave a small smile, picking up her bag. "See you tomorrow then." "See you tomorrow," William replied, watching her leave. When the door closed, he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had been. Something about Stella made him feel things he thought he had buried long ago, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge it. The next morning, the plan began to be put into practice. They called a meeting with key shareholders, suppliers, and strategic partners. The conference room was filled with anxious murmurs as the guests waited. The aroma of coffee and new paper filled the air, mixed with the occasional sound of cell phone notifications and the clink of cups against plates. Stella led the first part of the presentation. His voice was firm and clear, and every word he said seemed to capture the attention of everyone in the room. With the evidence projected on a screen behind her, she dismantled every aspect of Jonathan's scheme with precision. There was something magnetic about his presence, a confidence that seemed to light up the room, even when the content was so serious. When she finished, William took over. He spoke with the same authority that had made him respected. But there was something more there, a personal determination that carried every sentence. He concluded the presentation with such a confident tone that it was impossible for those present to ignore the gravity of what they had just heard. The silence that followed was broken by murmurs of approval. The looks exchanged between the participants reflected not just surprise, but admiration for both William and Stella. After the meeting, as they watched the guests leave, Stella turned to William with an exhausted but triumphant smile. "I think we did it." William allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, we did it, but it's not over yet." "I know," she said, crossing her arms. "But no matter what comes next, I know we can face it." There was a certainty in her voice that warmed something inside him. For the first time in a long time, William felt hope, and that was something he knew he couldn't have found on his own. The morning of the event dawned under a vibrant blue sky, as if even the New York weather decided to cooperate. The sun illuminated the imposing building where the presentation of the Orion project would be held, its windows reflecting the frenetic movement of the streets below. Inside the convention hall, the atmosphere was a meticulous combination of elegance and professionalism. Spotlights bathed the elevated stage in bright, direct light, highlighting the details of the impeccably polished lectern. Rows of black leather chairs were perfectly lined up, each occupied by sharp-eyed investors, camera-wielding journalists, and rival executives trying to mask their intentions. The faint aroma of fresh flowers, carefully arranged in discreet centerpieces, mixed with the metallic, chemical smell of audiovisual equipment. It was a scenario prepared to impress, but full of tension. Backstage, William Carter stood before a large, simple framed mirror. His reflection showed a man in an impeccable dark blue suit, but with his shoulders slightly tense and his gaze more intense than usual. As he adjusted his shirt cuffs with automatic movements, his mind seemed to process everything that could go wrong. He inhaled deeply, but the air, filled with the smell of electrical cables and equipment, did little to alleviate the building pressure. "Nervous?" Stella's voice sounded behind him, soft but full of restrained energy. He turned to face her, offering a quick, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't have time for nervousness." Stella raised an eyebrow and let out a short laugh, trying to ease the tension. Her black dress was simple but perfectly fitted, exuding a confidence that she felt needed to demonstrate more than she actually possessed. Her usual floral scent seemed a comforting contrast to the austere, technical surroundings. "You are ready, William." "We are." They have no way of contesting what we are going to present. For a moment, he held her gaze, absorbing the conviction in her words. For the first time that day, he let himself be a little infected by the confidence that Stella seemed to radiate. "I hope you're right," he said, taking the folder with the documents that contained the essence of the plan. When the moment for the presentation arrived, an almost ceremonial silence took over the hall. The lights dimmed, except for the stage, where William walked steadily up. He looked around the room, analyzing each face. The faint sound of camera flashes filled the air, and he knew everyone was expecting something memorable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the room with a clarity that silenced any murmurs. The Orion Project is not just a technological innovation. It's a statement of what we can achieve when we bring our minds and resources together to solve real problems. The words were measured, but filled with genuine passion. Each syllable seemed carefully chosen to capture the audience's attention. And for a moment, William let the impact of his words sink in. Behind him, the huge screen began projecting the Orion's technical details, showing just how revolutionary the design was. When the climax of the performance arrived, William paused. The hall fell into an almost palpable silence. His gaze stopped briefly on Jonathan Blake, sitting in the third row. The man wore a condescending smile, but the tension in his shoulders said he knew what was coming. "But before we go any further, it's important that you know the whole story," William continued, and his tone became more serious. The screen changed abruptly, displaying irrefutable evidence of Jonathan and Titan Dynamics' actions. Fraudulent financial transactions, compromising messages, and even audio recordings emerged, each adding weight to the revelation. William presented the evidence calmly, dismantling Jonathan's scheme with surgical precision. Murmurs began to spread throughout the room, but William maintained absolute control. He explained every detail with the authority of someone who knew he was right. Meanwhile, Jonathan, who was initially relaxed in his chair, now sported a light sheen of sweat on his forehead. He exchanged glances with Titan Dynamics executives, but there was little they could do other than watch the public destruction of his reputation. Stella, sitting discreetly at the side of the stage, watched with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. She knew this was a turning point not just for William, but for her as well. Then, an unexpected technical failure wiped out the projection. The hall was plunged into darkness for a few seconds, and a murmur of confusion rose among those present. William remained calm, but Stella immediately realized that this was no accident. With quick movements, she took out her cell phone and started sending messages to the technical team, coordinating the resolution. Meanwhile, William continued, "When truths like these come to light, there are those who try to erase them, but the truth has a way of finding its way." The lights came back on and the projection was restored. A sigh of relief passed through the room, but William knew that the moment needed to be resumed with full force. He looked straight at Jonathan, his expression hard as stone. Some believe they can manipulate, lie, and destroy to achieve their goals. Today, we proved them wrong. The hall erupted in applause. Some investors leaned in to discuss among themselves, while journalists frantically took notes. Jonathan stood up abruptly and left the room, his expression a mix of fury and defeat. Backstage, William found Stella. She was leaning against the wall with a smile that mixed exhaustion and pride. "You were brilliant," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. He gave a small smile, but this time it was real. "I wouldn't have done it without you." There was a moment of silence between them, but it was a silence full of meaning. Stella lowered her eyes for a moment, but when she looked at him again, there was something different in her expression. "We did it, William. Together." He nodded slowly, feeling for the first time in a long time that he could finally breathe. The city lights, seen from a nearby window, shone as if celebrating the moment. For William and Stella, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one they would face side by side. The sun shone brightly over Manhattan, dyeing the skyscrapers a resplendent gold that seemed to highlight every curve and angle of the imposing buildings. Carter Innovations, standing as a symbol of resilience and power, reflected the sun's rays from its polished windows, transforming into a beacon in the heart of the city. Inside, the air was charged with renewed energy, mixed with the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and the light scent of freshly laid flowers at the reception. In William Carter's room, the silence was almost reverent. He was standing in front of the large window, with his hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed on the vastness of the city. His dark blue suit, perfectly tailored, shone in the natural light that invaded the space, and the woodsy aroma of his perfume filled the room, mixing with the smell of leather that emanated from his chair. The surroundings were as impeccable as his appearance, but something about William seemed different. On his desk, the papers were organized in symmetrical piles, but in the center there was a single document that stood out, the contract that formalized his return as CEO of Carter Innovations. The signature, fresh and definitive, closed a painful chapter and marked the beginning of a new one. After weeks of negotiations and carefully executed strategies, Jonathan Blake and Titan Dynamics had been toppled. The media and financial markets were full of headlines about his deceptions, as William regained not only his position, but also his dignity. The rhythmic sound of footsteps in the hallway brought him out of his thoughts. When the door opened, Stella Monroe entered the room. She was radiant, the navy blue dress she wore highlighting her natural elegance, and the light floral perfume that always accompanied her seemed to bring with it a breeze of freshness to the heavy environment. There was something about the discreet smile she offered William that made him relax slightly, as if the mere fact of her presence made the day a little lighter. "It looks like everything is back to normal," Stella said, looking around the office curiously. William turned to her, allowing himself a smile that, although small, was genuine. "Not everything." He leaned back on the table, crossing his arms. "Some things have changed for the better." Stella laughed softly, but there was a gleam in her eyes that showed more than simple satisfaction. There was pride, relief, and perhaps a pang of longing for what I knew was about to change. "With you back in command, I'm sure things will only get better," she replied, her tone more serious now. William tilted his head slightly, studying her for a moment. He knew she was ready to move on, to explore a new path that went beyond the walls of Carter Innovations. "Stella, I want to talk to you about something," he began, his voice firm, but not without a hint of hesitation. She placed the tablet she was carrying on the table and crossed her arms, her eyes shining with curiosity. "What it was?" "I know you have plans beyond here," he said, carefully choosing his words. "And I want you to know that whatever path you choose, you will have my full support." She was silent for a moment, as if deciding how to respond. Finally, a soft smile appeared on his lips. "Actually, I've been waiting for the right time to talk to you about this." William frowned, interested. "About what?" "I want to create a foundation, William," she said, her voice taking on a more animated tone. "Something that can really make a difference." He raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. "A foundation?" "Yes," she continued, approaching the table and resting her hands on the top. "During this time here, I realized that I am not the only one who has faced manipulation and injustice. There are so many women out there who, like me, have been brought down by circumstances that were beyond their control. I want to help them get back on their feet." William was silent, watching her closely as she spoke. There was a raw passion in her voice, a conviction that he recognized as something rare and precious. "That's admirable, Stella," he said finally, his voice thick with sincerity. "And I'm sure it will be a success." "Does that mean you won't try to convince me to stay?" she asked, arching an eyebrow with a playful smile. William laughed softly, shaking his head. "I can't stop you from going your way, Stella, but I also know that this company will always be a little bit of yours." She felt a warmth in her chest upon hearing this. "I thought I'd start small," she said, changing her tone to something more practical. "Workshops for women in vulnerable situations, offering professional training and legal support. Something that really empowers them." "Do you already have a name for the foundation?" asked William, genuinely curious. Stella hesitated for a moment, her eyes shining with excitement. "New Horizon." William nodded slowly, as if savoring the name. "It's perfect." The next few minutes passed in a lively discussion about Stella's ideas. William suggested contacts who could help her get started, even offering initial financial support. Stella, however, insisted that she wanted to build the foundation with her own efforts. It was a matter of proving to herself and the world that she was capable of achieving something great on her own merits. Later that day, William watched her as she interacted with other team members. His soft laugh filled the room with an energy that seemed to infect everyone around him. He knew she was ready to leave, but the thought of not seeing her there every day left a void he still didn't know how to fill. At the end of the day, Stella returned to William's office for one last conversation before going home. "So what's next for the great CEO?" she asked with a provocative smile. William crossed his arms, an amused gleam in his eyes. "Rebuild, consolidate, making sure this company is never vulnerable to someone like Jonathan Blake again. It seems like a difficult task, not as much as convincing you to work with me." She laughed, shaking her head. "It was a pleasure, William. In truth." He walked her to the door and before she left, said, "Stella, you will always have a place here." She stopped, looking at him with a warm smile. "I know, and you will always have my support, wherever I am." With that, she left, leaving the room silent, but not lonely. For the first time in years, William felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As night fell over Manhattan, the city's lights twinkled like stars, each symbolizing a new possibility. And somewhere among those lights, Stella began to build the new horizon, while William looked out the window, reflecting on the future with something rare: hope. The night air was cool, bringing with it a light humidity that carried the sweet scent of flowers from Central Park, mixing with the metallic smell of distant traffic and the faint touch of dry leaves scattered on the ground. Manhattan, illuminated by its countless signs and windows, seemed to breathe more slowly that night, as if the city had taken a break from its incessant rhythm to offer a moment of tranquility. William Carter was sitting on a wooden bench near the lake, a place away from the usual hustle and bustle of the city. The soft reflection of the lights on the buildings danced across the surface of the water, creating constantly changing patterns. He held a still hot cup of coffee, the steam rising in thin, sinuous tendrils, dispersing on the night breeze. His posture, although still elegant, was more relaxed than usual, but his eyes, fixed on the horizon, revealed the silent battle of thoughts that was raging within him. He rarely allowed moments like this. The constant search for control, for the next goal, often prevented him from simply waiting. But that night, he needed it. What he was about to say carried a weight that couldn't be expressed with spreadsheets or graphs, and it made him anxious in a way he wasn't used to dealing with. The sound of footsteps on the paved path behind him caught his attention. He looked up and saw her. Stella Monroe walked towards him, wrapped in an elegant black coat that framed her silhouette softly, the fabric shimmering faintly in the streetlights. Her loose hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and the light floral scent he had come to associate with her arrived even before her words. "I didn't know you liked quiet places like this," she said, a playful smile curving her lips as her eyes sparkled with curiosity. William stood up to greet her, a simple gesture, but one filled with respect and something else that he still hesitated to name. "There are many things about me you don't know," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. She let out a soft laugh, the melody of her voice echoing in the tranquility around her. "Maybe it's time we rectify that then." For a moment, they were silent, just watching each other in the dim streetlights. The air seemed thicker, charged with something invisible but palpable. "And what brings me here?" Stella asked, tilting her head slightly, her smile now more curious than playful. William took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs, but not dispel the tension in his chest. "I needed a place away from the office," he said, gesturing to the surrounding park. "And I wanted to talk to you." "About what?" Their eyes met, and William felt as if time had slowed down. The words he had rehearsed so many times seemed inadequate now that they were in front of her. "About us." Stella's smile diminished, her eyes widening slightly. He saw her breathing falter for a moment, something so subtle that only someone who knew her well would notice. Yes, he replied, taking a step forward. The distance between them was now minimal, and the breeze that lightly ruffled her hair brought back the floral perfume that seemed to surround her like a signature. "Stella, you changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. When you showed up in that office, I thought it would be a disaster. And in a way, it was. But it was the kind of disaster I needed." She laughed, a brief, almost shy sound, but her eyes were watery with something she still wasn't sure how to express. "You challenged me. It made me see the world in a different way. And most importantly, it made me realize that there was something missing in my life. William, She began, but he raised his hand asking for silence. "Let me finish," he said, his voice shaking slightly with the intensity of the moment. "I know it took me a while to realize it, and maybe even longer to admit it, but I love you, Stella." The words hung in the air between them, as tangible as the breeze that surrounded them. Stella's heart seemed to pound in her chest, so loud she thought William could hear it. "I love you," he repeated, with a sincerity that made his gaze seem softer than she had ever seen it. "And I don't want to ignore it anymore." She was silent for a moment, but there was no hesitation in her eyes, just a mixture of surprise and joy. "William, you have no idea how long I waited to hear this." With those words, she took a step forward, and before he could say anything else, their lips met. The kiss started soft, almost hesitant, but soon became something more intense, filled with everything that had remained unsaid between them for so long. The surrounding breeze seemed to disappear, along with the distant noise of the city. It was as if the entire world had reduced to just the two of them. When they broke apart, they were both panting, their faces lit up with smiles that spoke more than any words could. "That was unexpected," William said, an amused glint coming into his eyes. "I'd say it took a long time to happen," Stella replied, teasing him with a smile that made his heart race again. They sat on the bench, this time side by side, their hands intertwined as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The soft sound of water lapping against the shore seemed like a perfect musical background for the moment. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at him with a mixture of expectation and confidence. "Now, we face whatever comes. Together." She leaned lightly against him, feeling the warmth of his presence. "I like how that sounds," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As they walked back, the city lights twinkling in the distance, they both knew challenges were yet to come. However, at that moment, there was no doubt that they would face everything together, with a bond stronger than any threat that could arise. But in the shadows, a man in a dark suit watched them from afar. Leaning against a black car, he held his cell phone to his ear. "There's still a problem," he said, his voice low and clipped, "but we'll deal with it." As the car disappeared into the darkness, William and Stella remained oblivious to the new threat. For them, the night was just the beginning of a future that, for the first time, seemed full of hope and possibility.